I'd like to call the meeting of the TIF Review Committee to order, please.
Grayson.
Here.
Grody. Alternate is here.
Yes, alternate's here.
Lutt. Lute, I'm sorry. Kirkpatrick.
Here.
Schwank.
Here.
Stegman.
Here.
Barry.
Here.
Bingham.
Here.
Denton.
Here.
Ross.
Here.
And Hector. All accounted for.
All right. Item 2, approval of the minutes of the Tax Increment District Review Committee from December 13th. I'll entertain a motion to approve those. And if anybody needs to look at, do we have them printed off or anything, Susan?
They were emailed with the agenda to them, so.
Everybody had a chance to look at those?
Until I kind of get your names familiar, I'm sorry, we're all kind of new here. Give me your last name when you make a motion, please.
This is Jennifer Stegman, and I move that we approve the minutes.
Kirkpatrick, I second.
Got a motion and a second. Roll call, please.
Mosley.
Yes.
Lutt. Yes. Kirkpatrick.
Yes.
Schwank.
Yes.
Stegman.
Yes.
Barry.
Yes.
Bingham.
Yes.
And Denton.
Yes. Item 3, discussion of status of proposed tax increment district, including but not limited to A, review of TIF process and purpose of the TIF review committee, B, proposed boundaries of prospective TIF increment district, C, proposed infrastructure improvements and related project cost.
Good afternoon. Am I on? Yep. Okay. Nate Ellis, Public Finance Law Group. We've been retained by the city to help facilitate the process of looking at a TIF district for Chickasha. First thing I'll do, just real quick process. Some of you heard this a few weeks back. Some of you are at-large members that maybe haven't heard this, but kind of what our process is for a TIF district. A TIF district is an economic development tool. It allows a city to designate a specific area for development or redevelopment and capture the incremental new tax revenues that result from that development. And those revenues would be dedicated to pay costs that help facilitate that development moving forward. So that may be, under the law, that can be anything from purely public infrastructure to, private incentives to a company to do something or locate something, add jobs, whatever the case may be. So there's a broad range of what is allowed under that. The process starts when a city adopts a resolution of intent, which they did a few months back, and that directs the development of a project plan. And the project plan will be an ultimate document that covers all the details of where the TIF is going to be, what it's going to capture, how long it's going to last, how the revenues are going to be expended, what the projected projects or development are within that. And then also forms a statutory review committee, which is this body. It has representatives of the city's planning commission, all of the ad valorem taxing entities that overlie the areas that are being considered, and then 3 representatives from the community at large representatives. So we have a total body of 10 people. And your responsibility ultimately will be to make a recommendation to the city council with respect to the project plan that's ultimately presented. And that recommendation can be to approve it as it is, to not approve it, or to approve it with certain conditions or stipulations that we might just, instead, as we talk, we might incorporate those into the project plan. But we'll kind of work through that as we go. And then also you will make a finding as to the financial impacts on all the taxing entities and business activities that may be going. And so with respect to the taxing entities, that'll be ultimately in the form of a resolution that'll have a blow-by-blow account of all the different levy types for each of the different taxing jurisdictions and what the potential impact is, and then it'll have basically an exhibit that's attached to it that'll describe how much revenue, based on the development assumptions, how much revenue would actually be captured by the TIF district, and then how much of that would be allocated to project costs, how much might be allocated back to the taxing entities as a revenue stream, and what forth. So we'll again, kind of work through all that. Not all that's going to happen today, obviously. So you make that recommendation ultimately to the City Council. The Planning Commission will also meet once we finish our process and we've got a project plan. The Planning Commission will also look at that, and they'll make a recommendation. There'll be 2 public hearings, and then after all of that has happened, then the City Council can consider its TIF ordinance to actually adopt the project plan and create the TIFs if they should choose. So, any questions about the process, why you're here? Okay, so we've been working with staff quite diligently for many weeks now, working through, there's 2 primary areas that are being considered at this point for a TIF district. They would conceptually be TIF number 2 and TIF number 3. For kind of sake of clarification at this point, we'll call the downtown area that is under consideration TIF number 2. We'll consider the area that is east of downtown, basically between downtown and the I-44 interchange along Highway 62. We'll call that TIF 3. So again, that doesn't necessarily, they might be named a different number at the end of the day, but for now, we'll just kind of keep it simple that way. So you can see just on the map here what we're talking about, and these 2 different development projects. The downtown project is really more of a redevelopment project. You have some areas that are kind of dilapidated. You've got some buildings that are underutilized or vacant. You've got some lots that have been cleared, aren't really being used at this point. And so the concept of that is to try and revitalize the downtown area, encourage development, that might be in the form of retail or other commercial, office, whatever the case may be, different uses, whether it's hotels, boutique retail. And that's the blue area that's on the map, and we'll zoom into that here in a minute, not just yet. The green area, which is the TIF number 3 that we're talking about. This is area that would be more of a gateway to Chickasha to try and capture people, a lot of traffic that drives right by on the interstate, provide potential services along the corners of the interstate there for development that can capture, sales tax dollars that are potentially coming by and give people additional reasons to stop along and visit Chickasha, and then ultimately migrate in throughout the town. So that's more of a new development. There are some businesses out there, but there's a lot of, as you're probably familiar, there's a lot of open land out there that prospectively could be developed. The key challenge to all of this is there's a lot of public infrastructure improvements, specifically water and sewer, that need to be completed in order to facilitate any of this development. There's been conversations about potential projects that are interested in downtown Chickasha, but there's some real limitations to that, because if you build up and start adding a lot of additional uses, start using second and third floors of buildings, there's just simply not sufficient water pressure for the required fire protection that you have, or that you need to have in place for that. And then there's just kind of the concern as to the aging infrastructure that you have there, that you potentially, you just burst your lines as soon as you start turning on additional taps. So there's significant infrastructure needs in the downtown area that need to be completed in order to allow that development to occur. And then there needs to be extension of services out into the TIF 3 area in order to provide for any meaningful development as well. And it's not kind of a pick one or the other, because really the system is going to go through downtown for the most part. So if you try and just develop out the downtown system, can't really handle the throughput to develop the area out along the interstate as well. So you kind of need, the infrastructure improvements really kind of cross-benefit both areas. So what we will probably look at, and there's two key terms that we talk about. There's an increment district, and so that's the geographic area. We draw a line around the parcels, and everything in there, whatever is the existing tax base, whether it's sales tax, hotel tax, ad valorem, whatever that existing number is, that is preserved, and the revenues on that, those are not new revenues, those continue to flow to the appropriate taxing jurisdiction. The increment, hence the name tax increment financing, or TIF, only captures the new revenue that's generated. So in the case of ad valorem, if you have the value increases on the property because of the development, it's going to capture that new tax revenue over and above. When we have a district like the downtown area, there's already a fair amount of valuation in that area to begin with. And so, there's potentially the risk that the value overall of properties decline. The increment has to make up whatever decline there might be before there's actually a new increment. So it's kind of a fixed value. The taxes off that value might be a little bit different from one year to the next because the levy rates might change just a little bit for, the school bonds. They levy a little bit more, a little bit less in every given year, but they're targeting approximately that same number. We kind of assume for our assumptions it'll be a steady line out into the future, but we know it's gonna wiggle just a little bit. So all of that revenue off of that base value goes to the taxing jurisdictions. In the case of sales tax, there's a calculation that's done based on what the historical sales tax collections have been within that geographic boundary, and then the increment only exists to the extent that you have more sales tax being generated than what the historical baseline was. So for that downtown area, if we want to go ahead and zoom in to that, we spent a pretty significant amount of time going through the different parcels, trying to make as reasonably possible as many straight line areas. So we avoided areas like on the right-hand side at the bottom, you see the park. That is proposed that would be an asset that the TIF district and redevelopment wants to take advantage of, so we don't include it. It's not generating any taxes right now. It's not projected it'll generate any taxes in the future. You see along the bottom, there's a number of church properties there. We don't really anticipate those churches moving or going anywhere, so it doesn't make sense to include most of their property. There's just immediately to the right of the First Baptist Church, I guess immediately to the east there's a lot that they currently use, I think is an overflow lot. It's the sort of property, it might very well be prime for redevelopment. Ultimately, any property owner that has property within the TIF district, two things. One, they're going to pay whatever taxes they owe based on the value of their property. So the TIF doesn't raise their taxes, it doesn't lower their taxes, it doesn't abate their taxes in any way. They're obligated to pay whatever their taxes are based on the applicable levies on any given year. And two, they are under no obligation, just by virtue of being in the TIF district, that they have to do anything with their property. Now, the idea, we've tried to identify the areas that potentially could be redeveloped, maybe parcels, multiple parcels that could be bought by somebody for a larger scale project. Ultimately, that'll be up for a developer to make them an offer that they can't refuse to sell their property, to put it to a different use than what it's currently under. The city, in Oklahoma, the city doesn't have power of eminent domain to go in and take their property and redevelop it. They will have to ultimately agree to that. The city can only use condemnation proceedings basically for infrastructure improvements, which presumably they wouldn't need to do in any of this, in this particular case. So there's this spot right in the middle. It's right there. We excluded First National Bank and Trust property. I mean, it's got a pretty significant amount of current value on it. As we understand, it's not speaking for them, but as we understand, they don't have any plans to do any major projects with respect to their property, and so it made sense to exclude that. Most of the other buildings have potential to, maybe add something to a second floor or redevelop a first floor, whether it's vacant or they're vacant lots, and there's ability to build things and add its purpose. But so we did intentionally exclude First National Bank and Trust from that, and so what that means, again, doesn't change their property taxes anyway. It just means it won't be a part of the TIF. So to the extent that they have any change in valuation, that's just going to pass through to all the taxing jurisdictions, as it would. If they go in and do a project and add some value to it, it wouldn't be captured by the TIF district because that property's been excluded. Around the outer boundaries, especially on the south, again, I mentioned there's church properties, and then you get into areas that are residential, and so we tried to kind of pare it back. The areas that are residential, that are fully residential, we generally excluded most of those. There's a few areas that have a couple of houses down, right kind of where he's pointing along the south end of the district. There's a number of lots that have already been cleared on there. There's a handful of houses there still. That was one that kind of in our opinion made sense to include within the boundaries of the increment district, because there's already kind of been a clearing process there, and that might continue all the way to fruition of somebody locating there for something new. So any questions? That's kind of been, I think, one of the key questions initially that people have asked. Where are we talking about? What are the proposed boundaries of the district? So this is kind of our first cut of what we think makes sense based on potential for development and or redevelopment projects at this time.
Can I ask a question?
Uh-huh.
I'm not real clear. You said they still pay property taxes. Are those facilities going to be assessed every year, and then whatever increase over what it is goes to
Yes.
whatever is decided? Is that, but they still pay the
They will still pay,
assessed
yeah.
property?
So for instance, if I'm going to pick on a business, I don't know anything about them. Nayland's Beauty and Spa, that's right in there, all right? They have a tax bill that they pay every year right now for real property, assuming they own the building, real property taxes, and then whatever business personal property they have in there. So those accounts are located within the TIF district. So when a TIF is created, finally, one of the steps is the county assessor will go in and they will add up all the different accounts. What is the assessed value of all the accounts that exist within that geographic boundary, and it'll come up to some total number, okay? So for purposes of example, we'll assume everything else stays the same and nobody does anything. But Nayland Beauty and Spa goes in, tears down their building, okay? At that point in time, if they just tore down the building and didn't do anything else, the total valuation of the increment district would be lower, okay? So at that point, here's our baseline, and everything on this baseline still goes to the taxing jurisdictions, however many tax dollars that is. If they've now lowered the total value, the sum total value of all the properties, there is no increment. Now, if they go in and build a 100-story skyscraper, okay, now the value goes way up here of the entire increment district. The increment will capture this tax revenue on this value that's above the baseline. It will not capture any of what's below. Clear as mud. Other questions?
doesn't have to be the full increment though, right? That's something that we can talk
Yeah,
about
so,
later. But
so one of the things that we'll talk about is kind of the context of where we're ultimately going. We identify an area. We are still working through a set of development projections. So kind of what do we reasonably think could happen, and how much new tax revenue does that actually mean in the form of ad valorem, sales tax, hotel tax. And so, ultimately, we'll have a set of assumptions that we'll present to you. And based on that set of assumptions, there's going to be a series of revenue streams that exist over time, okay? A TIF district can last for up to 25 years. It can capture up to 100% of any of those local revenue streams. That doesn't mean that it has to. And so the other side of the equation, we have our revenues. The other side of the equation is we have the costs of the improvements that have been identified, that we'll talk about here in a minute. What do we need to do to allow this development to actually happen? And so revenue, expenses, and then we start to look based on those, all right, how much of the revenue streams do we need and for how long to reasonably be able to accomplish that? In a lot of cases, when we create a TIF district, we'll create it for the maximum 25 years, but we'll always have verbiage in there that the TIF lasts until all the project costs have been paid, or the end date that's 25 years out, whichever comes first. We can certainly create it for a shorter period of time than 25 years. 20 years, the TIF number 1 was actually created for a term of 15 years, and so it expired back in 2020, I think. So again, part of that analysis, though, is how much revenue do we really think we can generate? What are our expense numbers that we anticipate? So how much of the revenue for how long do we actually need to be able to accomplish that? So that's kind of how we arrive at the end result. Other questions? So we'll look at the other increment district area. So one of our constraints when we're creating a city TIF district, we can only include area that's within the corporate boundaries of the city. So any unincorporated areas outside the city limits cannot be part of a city TIF. It would have to be a county-created TIF in order to have that over that area. So the northern boundaries, in a lot of respects, I mean, they kind of roughly follow the city limits, don't they? Because I think that those larger open areas, kind of on the left side of the district, those are outside. So most of the northern boundaries follow along the increment district or the river. The boundaries of the city actually extend up along the turnpike and pick up the now Love's and McDonald's that's up there, the turnpike or service area. But we've got those parcels that are basically 3 of the 4 corners. The 4th corner that's not included right along, that is not within the city limits. So it couldn't be included in the TIF district without that property being annexed. And then we've taken that area that's along 62, and you see, north and south, north kind of as far as we can go north within the city limits. The south, we're just basically picking up those parcels. Those are larger parcels that exist. And then when we get to where it says Chickasha swap meet there, a lot of that area is part of fairgrounds area, either fairgrounds or potential fairgrounds expansion. And so it's not generating significant ad valorem, and long-term don't anticipate, so it wouldn't make sense to put a TIF over the top of the fairgrounds and collect nothing on it. So we've excluded out those properties, and then we continue south along that corridor on either side, where there's potential development along that's Grand Avenue that comes to the south there. So those are the other area that's there, the OSU South Central Research Area, that area that's excluded out to the turnpike. I mean, that is within city limits. It is something that could be included, but at this stage, it seems a much lower prospect of significant long-term development. Probably makes sense to exclude that. If the entire area develops significantly and there's further development that ultimately goes in that area, then that'd be great. If we get additional development outside the TIF boundaries, then 100% of that revenue is going to all the taxing entities and it's not tied up within the TIF district. Any questions on those boundaries? Suggestions, concerns? This is not necessarily the final say at this point, so you're not like, it's helpful to myself and to staff, if you've got any significant feedback, that do like it, don't like it, think there's other areas we should consider including. I mean, those are all helpful ideas there, but again, that's kind of our first cut after several weeks of work of identifying different parcels that make the most sense to include in the TIF district or TIF districts.
I'm gonna speak up and ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Career Tech, 90% of our funding is ad valorem. With the growth, we are able to add programs, et cetera. Without growth in our ad valorem, we stay pretty stagnant. We definitely consider ourselves a part of economic development and creating a workforce pipeline for our community. Just considering is the space, the area, like how many square miles is that? How big of an area have we captured? Is it bigger than it needs to be? Is it, I mean, I'm.
That doesn't seem right. About 8.5 square miles? Is that right? Or is that? Oh, okay, thank you, okay. Yeah, so a little less than 1 square mile on the larger district, and the downtown area is 90.4 acres, which is I have to, yeah, it's definitely less than half. This is a conversion I always have to look up. I can't remember this one off the top of my head. Let's see, 640 is a square mile. So yeah, probably less than 0.2 square miles, less than a quarter square mile total on the downtown area.
And will we see the current valuations of each of those TIFs? That'll be part of what we see?
Yes. Yeah, well, and I mean, we have that. I don't know. We've got kind of an aggregate spreadsheet, but again, I don't think I had the latest version after we went through last time with the map. So, but yes, yeah, we'll have the information that shows what the historical baseline tax is relative to the ad valorem, and with respect to sales tax on the downtown, it may take a little work in determining what that specific baseline is. That's not quite as easy to determine as the ad valorem is, but yeah, we do have that information and can provide that. So the taxes that are generated on the green district actually significantly less than the taxes that are generated in the downtown area, just because of the concentrated number of properties that
Right.
have been developed already.
That's what I was thinking. Acres doesn't really matter.
No.
It's the,
No, but it's still space, and if we're talking
Yes.
25 years, I mean, I'm gonna be gone in 25 years, but it's still gonna impact
Sure.
the school.
Yeah, so again, kind of conceptually, what we'll plan to do, most TIF districts anymore are done, and I'll at this point just speak to ad valorem, but it's similar for sales tax and hotel tax, is that there's some sort of allocation of the revenues where, you know, we just for basic purposes call it 50-50. You know, so the TIF would capture 100% of that new value. 50% of that revenue stream would be dedicated to the project costs. The other 50% would be dedicated to go back to the taxing jurisdictions, and they would get that on a pro rata basis based on you know, what their respective levies is. So the school would get the vast majority of it. The tech center and the county would get approximately the same amount, you know, 10 to 12 mils, somewhere in that range. Health department would get their couple of mils, EMS would get their couple of mils, and so on and so forth. So the bulk of it would go to the school district. And one of the things, and this would be different than what we structured on TIF 1. In the case of TIF 1, if I remember right, it captured 75% of the ad valorem, and all of that 75% was to go to project costs. The other 25% just went back to the taxing jurisdiction. So there was a growth component in there. For all the different taxing jurisdictions other than the school district, it really doesn't matter. Because, I mean, if we call it a 75% TIF and then you get the other 25%, or if we called it a 100% TIF and you got 25%, you're gonna get the same amount either way. For the school district, it matters because we treat that revenue as basically a revenue stream that's available for capital expenditures for the school district at the school's discretion. I mean, they could use it however they want, wherever they want within their district. But all of those general fund dollars that are coming in, or the half of the general fund dollars that are coming back to the school, the half of the sinking fund dollars, half of the building fund, those get treated that way so that they don't get a chargeable offset. If they have development, if the property values go up and they generate more from their general fund levy, everything else being equal approximately, they're going to get a corresponding decrease in the amount of state aid that they receive based on that, because they they're capped based on the calculation of how much they get, and they get whatever they get from local sources, and then state aid comes in and fills the rest of it up to the state mandated dollars per student. So when we treat it that way within the TIF district, now it's a revenue stream that's available to them for basically it's like capital impact aid. It doesn't get treated as that offset. So they still get the extra state aid to the extent they have increased operational costs. If they have additional students, they're going to get, $10,000 more per student or whatever the number is. They're going to get the state aid. So it's kind of like a double dip for the school district in that. It actually amounts a little bit to a windfall during the period of the TIF district. But understanding, part of this committee's purpose is to identify what are the different impacts on the taxing jurisdictions. And it's helpful when we go through with actual numbers based on a set of development projections. How much money are we talking about? And right now we're talking about the baseline all goes to the taxing jurisdictions, and we can see how much of that everybody gets. And then we have zero increment. So right now everybody's getting 100% of nothing. And the idea is, does it make sense if we can give you 50% of something for a period of time, which allows these projects to be done, which enhances the tax base, and ultimately, when the TIF ends, then you've got a larger tax base that all of those revenues are flowing to the taxing jurisdictions. So that's kind of the purpose, and that's the analysis that we'll ultimately do, that you'll make a recommendation with respect to what that is and identify what those numbers are based on the set of assumptions. Other questions, thoughts on that? All right, we want to talk about the infrastructure projects.
Thank you.
I've got on here, but I haven't transferred it to you. I've got it on flash.
That way everybody can see it.
So good afternoon. My name is Scott Vaughn. I'm Chisholm Truck Consulting. An engineering firm, works quite a bit with the city of Chickasha on a lot of projects. Thankfully, very appreciative of that, by the way. What you see, sorry for speaking so loud, I normally do that anyway. Just ask my wife. But anyway, what you see before you is a little bit different than what Nate has presented. He has a more current version of the map than what I worked on quite some time back. Hopefully we'll be getting that on the screen here before too long. And so the concept, the map, yes. There you go. So the concept for this kind of originated from a concept evaluation I did several years ago for the city of Chickasha to think in terms of what water improvements would be needed to serve the east side of town. And we kind of added to that to provide for a conceptual TIF district. And so what you see there are, in the yellow is the current city limits. You see the black dotted line, which is a future water line to be of size to be determined. You see another black line that has like a solid line and then a dash. That's a future potential road. Remember, this is very conceptual, by the way. No surveying's been done, no engineering evaluation's been done in terms of, we haven't decided on road widths or road pavements or anything of that nature. It's all very conceptual. The yellow-green lines represent conceptual sanitary sewer mains that would be needed to serve that area. And then you have some varied colored lines, which are magenta, cyan, and there's some blue in there somewhere. Those represent potential water mains that would be needed to serve this area. As well as, if you could zoom in, there's kind of a T-shaped structure right there at the bottom of the screen. That represents a water storage tank. So to accomplish much development in the east part of town, you really, in terms of water, you really need to think in terms of expanding what is called your high pressure water system. But that's not enough. You really need to think in terms of storage, additional storage to serve that area. Storage is primarily for the function of meeting the everyday demand, but also for meeting the demands in case of a fire, quite frankly. Current regulations require us to size water mains and evaluate them for in the event of a firefighting situation. And it's a very important thing. It's a life safety matter. So these are just some conceptual layouts, if you will, of water lines, sewer lines, sanitary sewer lines, and water lines, as well as a water storage tank. And if you could go out of that drawing and go to the other PDF, which is the conceptual estimate. And again, remember, these were based on a different TIF district than what has been presented today. What has been presented today by Nate is a more updated and current version of the TIF, and so I would need to adjust this. But those are the estimated costs associated with those various infrastructure improvements shown on that map we just talked about. You have the water mains, the water storage tank, and sanitary sewer mains, and the roads. I separated out board crossings, I pay item 5 there, item number 5, simply to point out that you'd have to cross under the highway and various other streets with those facilities, water and sewer lines. Those are in the 2023 dollars, so, you know, inflation I'm sure has some impact on that, and I have not updated it based on the new TIF map, but I'll certainly be glad to do that in the near future, and I'll be glad to try to answer any questions if there are any.
A couple of things just to clarify as I'm thinking about it. I mean, so these costs are approximately representative of the infrastructure necessary for TIF 3, the green area.
Approximately, yeah.
It doesn't include cost estimates relative to some of the line replacement, things that need to be done in like downtown Chickasha.
Well, no, it does, actually. If you could go back to the map, please, sir. If you look, if you can, okay, go back to that previous, oh, you're doing great. Pan up, please. Continue, or pan down, I beg your pardon. I always get that backwards. Stop right there, please. So you see the magenta line on the left-hand side that's a dashed line? Then there's a yellow-green line right next to it that does represent a sanitary sewer main that would be, it is in the downtown area. I really don't know, to be honest, Nate, if that's included in TIF 2 or not. But other than that, yes, sir, you're right. I've not put together any kind of conceptual cost estimate for any kind of infrastructure improvements in TIF 2.
It would help in servicing the downtown area. I'm thinking maybe the component that we're missing are just some of the older line replacements that need to be done in the downtown area. It's
right.
Just really, you know, replacement of line, potentially upsizing a little bit.
Correct.
I mean, the city, I mean, you talked about consistent line breaks, probably been worse in the last couple of weeks, I would bet. And so there's just, you know, this would kind of be the opportunity to handle a lot of that.
Right.
At this time, and a lot of it's necessary in order to have a lot of development. I mean, significant redevelopment really can't occur if you can't find, you know, if you can't provide the appropriate fire pressures and things like that. You're not going to be able to have, you know, second-story restaurants or anything like that that are potentially proposed.
Yeah, and we can update that cost estimate in the map accordingly a bit.
So, I mean, this, not all of it, but, you know, it's a fairly significant component of infrastructure costs that's necessary to be able to develop out this area. Talking a little bit about that, not necessarily all of it has to be done right at once. I usually talk pretty loud too, but not necessarily all of the infrastructure has to be done at once. The city is probably not going to rush out and spend $30 million just kind of in the hopes that this all happens. So as part of this process, the TIF district identifies all the potential costs that would appropriately be paid by the TIF district. And so that's listed out in the project plan, and those become what we refer to as authorized project costs. If the city council adopts the TIF district, they have created the mechanism to capture this revenue stream, which can be used to pay or reimburse or pay debt service related to the costs of those project costs. It does not mean that when they create the TIF district, they have spent 30 million, 50 million, 20 million, whatever the number actually is. There will be a lot of further actions that the city needs to take, certainly with respect to each of the projects. I mean, they would go out and they would bid the projects. They might have other sources that they could supplement the funding, so the TIF might pay a portion of the cost and the city might contribute other funds they have available. There might be various grant funds or matching funds from different state or federal agencies that could potentially be a part of that. But we try to identify the universe of potential costs that we have within the TIF district with the idea that the city will work to bring those down, or spend as little of the TIF dollars as they have to be able to complete all of those projects with other potential sources being involved. So they have not committed that they will actually expend those. The other key thing that happens is you're going to have various development agreements that the city is going to need to enter into, and projects would generally move forward when you have proposed development projects that are reasonably anticipated to actually generate revenues on an order that are acceptable to help pay all or most of those project costs. So, for instance, a specific development project might be proposed. In order to do that, they've got to at least run the water line out to this part. Okay, that's probably not hydrologically accurate, but anyways, so there might be portions of projects that proceed at different levels, different phases as they go through, and as development commitments are made, and that would be in the form of contractual documents between the city and or one of its public trusts and whoever the developer would be. The city agrees that they're going to make this water, sewer, road improvement, and the developer is committed at that point to making this level of capital investment and putting in this particular type of business, which again we've kind of extrapolated out is going to have X value and generate Y in sales tax or hotel tax, whatever the number is that helps to offset those costs. There's a lag, there's a natural lag, because we know that until development occurs, once a building is completed, it goes on the tax rolls, and then it gets taxed. If it's on the tax rolls by December 31st of this year, then they're going to get a tax bill at the end of 2025, and those TIF revenues, by the time they pay them and it processes through, it's probably spring of 2026 before any ad valorem revenue actually comes in that's TIF revenues. Sales tax is a little quicker in the turnaround, but until the business is open and starts making sales, sales taxes are collected, they go to the tax commission, and by the time those are remitted back to the city, it's 2 to 3 months later by the time those revenues come in. So we have to have businesses that build things and sell things before there's going to be any TIF revenue. But usually we also have to have the infrastructure in place in order to serve those developments before they're going to be able to open for business. So that's one of the big challenges of this that we try and work out is different ways that we can leverage resources in order to get the infrastructure in place. And so a lot of times that can involve a developer may agree to front the costs of those infrastructure improvements or some portion of them, and then they get reimbursed over time for the cost of those infrastructure improvements. That's one way. The city could potentially go out and issue some sort of debt obligation or use cash that it then reimburses itself out of future revenues for the debt service or for the expenditure that it's made. The city may look at, do they have other capital fund resources that they could commit, that they want to go ahead and do these projects, or maybe they want to do more of the project than is necessary just for the development because of the scale and the economy of maybe doing a larger project at one time. The city may or may not be willing to commit to that. Those are all decisions that have to be made by the city at a later date, and would be largely informed by what might be ready to go forward as far as actual development projects. So we talk about our universe of costs. I mean, we expect that there would be some additional costs beyond these estimates relative to potentially, other water, sewer, and/or street improvements that might be needed downtown. So that'd be another element that we'll continue to work on to bring back to you. I don't know, I mean, those are, when you say $2023, are those construction plus engineering plus some amount of contingency, or what is actually? Okay. All right, so there's some amount of contingency that's baked into that number, but I mean, as I'm sure we've all experienced, costs of everything have gone up significantly in recent years. So, we may enlarge or enhance the contingency some to account for the fact that, not all those projects are going to be done for $2023. So, beyond that, within the universe of costs, and these are things that we're trying our best to determine as we can. I mentioned that there is, under the law, the ability for TIFs to provide some sort of private incentive, development incentive to developers. I'm not saying this because there is a desire that will be included or it should be included, but I want to just kind of throw it out there that if we identify that as a potential key need, that's one of the things that we would ask your consideration on, whether or not that makes sense and is appropriate. So,
Can you give us an example of what something like that would look like?
Well, so, I mean, I gave you the little cleaner example was, the developer is going to rebuild this building on this particular parcel downtown, and in order to do that, these segments of water line need to be replaced, enhanced, whatever the case may be. And so city's not going to do those funds. The developer would actually pay for those. Either they'd pay the city and the city would bid the project out, or they would actually do it and, be done to the appropriate specifications that it can then be dedicated over to the city. But then whatever the costs of that are, the developer would be repaid the costs of that as an incentive. I mean, that's probably one of the more common examples, but another example would be that you have a large retailer that is willing to locate there in a particular area. Maybe TIF 3 is the better example for this. There's a large box retailer that's willing to locate there, but they want some sort of, effectively sales tax rebate component. And that is something that could be designated as an authorized project cost, that you could have some amount available that, a portion of that new tax revenue that's being generated is going back to them as an incentive to get them to locate there. So
would that be done as the situation arises, or is that just written into the plan very vague and it's determined by?
So when we create the TIF district, we're going to have our universe of costs that we've identified. And so the city is basically bound to those numbers. That's how much they can expend to do all of these projects. One of those line items might be, $5 million for retail incentives or something like that. Again, I'm making a number up there, but that might be a line item that is in there. The city, typically the way we'll write it, and this is kind of subject to how the city wants to ultimately do it, but typically the way we'll write it is we'll have a total not to exceed amount for all projects, and then we'll have line items that are under that are based on estimated costs of the various things, but there's the ability to move things from one, if this water line costs a little bit less, but that sewer line costs a little bit more, we can just move those over, and that's kind of an administrative change within the overall number. The city can't go over that number without making some sort of an amendment to the project plan. They can do what we call a minor amendment So they could just, by, having on their agenda an amending ordinance, they could raise or lower the total authorized project costs without all the rest of the process of a TIF district, as long as the aggregate change is not more than 5% of the total cost. So for instance, if we have $20 million in total authorized project costs, they could, in theory, by amendment, just change, they could make it 21. But that would be the most that they could do. Anything more than that, they would have to come back, reestablish the review committee, and go back through that full process of recommendations and public hearings before they could then consider that amending. We call that a major amendment. So they can change the project cost amount, but not increase in aggregate. So, that could be 20 different amendments, and they could go up and down, up and down, up and down. As long as it doesn't cross that 5% above threshold, it doesn't change it. Likewise, on the area of the district, they could add area to the district as long as in aggregate they don't add more than 5% to that actual increment district based on the boundaries that were created, or and then so again, they could, you could drop this parcel off and add this parcel on. If, as we kind of got down, let's say, on the south end, it made sense, okay, they're actually going to buy this extra city block down there and do a large development. It might make sense to drop some other portion out and add that in if it's going to be slightly more than 5% to add it. But again, that's kind of the city's ability under the statutes of what they can do. So we identify that not to exceed number if we think, and again, I'm not saying that it is or isn't, if we think that something like a retail incentive or other, it's just kind of an incentive payment to get somebody to locate there. Think of it kind of like a closing fund or something like that. If it makes sense collectively that's something that should be included, given various development proposals in different states of readiness that are out there, then that is something we would want to include in the project. We would want to include verbiage to identify that type of project cost on the front end. And if we didn't have it, it's something that could be added later, but probably would require to kind of go back through the process. All right, we have this business, they'll come in if we do this for them, all right, let's look at the numbers, and does it make sense or does it not?
So that can be changed, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. So,
But-
you go.
Sorry. That can be changed, but the overall left and right limits that are set and adopted by the council on the increment capture and stuff like that cannot be changed unless they, I'm assuming, reform the committee and all that stuff. Okay.
Go back through the process. It's kind of like creating a new TIF. If you make any sort of major amendment to it, you go back through the same process.
Okay.
So I'm looking at TIF 3, and that is a large area, and looks like where most all the water stuff needs to be. So are we limiting as far as it can only be a really, really big industry coming in or retailer coming in? Like downtown, there could be several retailers coming in that you can make agreements with. How do you work it when it's that big and really the infrastructure needs to go to all of it? How would you make agreements with those?
Well, so you have a couple of questions. One, what do you actually need to do to get this particular development to happen? I mean, what component of the infrastructure actually needs to be done? There may be some developments that need very little improvement to do it, and there may be others that require significant improvement, and that's probably a function of exactly where on the map we're talking about. The idea is, and I think I started talking about this and then I veered into a different direction. The other term that's important besides the increment district is the project area. So the project area will be a larger box. We don't show it on here, but it will be drawn somewhere outside the perimeter of the two proposed increment districts. And that represents the area where various project activities might occur, okay? Being in the project area and not inside the TIF district also has no impact on the property value or what tax rates are or how much they have to pay, when they have to pay. All it is just and we typically just draw it in a nice, neat square around the area, but we want to pick up any activities that might be related to this project. We want to draw it large enough that we pick up those boundaries. So for example, I think on the infrastructure map, there was, you know, up towards the top there at the map, I mean, where you've got some of those water line improvements that are coming down from the very top there, those are outside of the increment district boundaries, but we would want our project area to be far enough north that would pick up that area where there might be some activity related. It doesn't mean that there's going to be activity on every inch of property within that project area. It just means that there will be activity within those boundaries. So we want our project area to be large enough that everything that might have to do with the TIF district is done within that boundary. There's no limitation on how big that could be. We could designate Grady County or the state of Oklahoma as a project area. That doesn't make a lot of sense, but we could if we wanted to.
So within that, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Did you have something?
Well, I was just, well, go ahead. Ask yours.
Within that project area, the TIF increment capture can fund projects in that area that
Yes.
benefits the TIF.
Correct.
For example, like our proposed Fire Station 3, that's going to service potentially that area. We can use the increment funds potentially
Yeah,
to help build that
yeah,
up.
if we've designated that as a project, that would be part of the TIF district, and it would not be inappropriate for, I mean, again, the different impacts that you're looking at is, I mean, what services have to be provided to that area? You know, in the case of the city, you've got police and fire service. Are there capital impacts relative to those services that are appropriate? You know, I'm thinking of other EMS districts. Chloe will be aware of this. I mean, where you've got impacts to some of the EMS districts because of the potential service that they may need to provide. I mean, that's something that could be identified. I mean, there's basically two ways that we can address potential impacts that we see. For purposes of schools, if we've got a development that's going to create a lot of new people coming into the school district, you know, from an operational standpoint, it may be fine because they're going to get the funding from one side of the equation or the other, but relative to the capital, if they don't have a place to put the students, I mean, that creates a significant burden. So we try and address what are the different impacts to all the potentially affected taxing entities, and the two ways we can address that is we can either identify specific costs that we pay for as TIF projects. And again, that could be the infrastructure, water, sewer, roads, but it could also be, you know, this improvement needs to be done at the school or something in order to serve the, you know, the students that are going to result because of this development. It needs to tie to the development generally, but it doesn't have to necessarily be 100% from the development. But there needs to at least be some sort of nexus to what those project costs. So for instance, it wouldn't be appropriate to include a water line replacement on the far west side of town that has absolutely nothing to do with development out in this area. But if it were the transmission line from the source of water from the water treatment plant, and that was the only way to get the water and it needed to be upgraded in order to get enough water to serve this area, then it would be an appropriate project. So,
I just had a question about, I understand the infrastructure and how you laid that out, but then in the downtown area, it just seemed, I'm not really clear, like, what is being proposed, I guess, there, or the, I don't know, I just see like
So-
the blue blob, and then but over here, we've got a layout of like the water lines and the sewer lines. So what's really gonna be happening in the downtown area?
So in the downtown area, I mean, the primary infrastructure, I'm not necessarily the best person to speak to, but I'll try to anyways. I mean, the downtown area, you've got a number of water and sewer lines that are just, they're aging and they don't have the capacity to handle,
So will we
they're
get
barely
a
hanging on
markup
with
of
what's
some-
out there right now, and any additional development would just escalate further issues with them. So there needs to be water lines replaced. That component of it's not reflected in the cost estimates, so that's something that the city will continue to work to identify that number and get a better handle on that.
I came up to offer my assistance with the answer, but he did pretty well.
Now, all that stuff will still have to be listed and included in, like you presented with us here, all that cost. You know?
Right, yeah.
And any project that's been identified within that TIF area also will need to be identified. That needs to be identified before, right? That can't just.
Yeah, we want to identify all of our, again, our universe of costs that are appropriate to be paid from the TIF. Again, that does not mean that the TIF will fund all of those costs or necessarily will be able to fund all those costs. The hope is that in being able to do those, maybe on a phased basis, there's enough development that ultimately all of those costs can be taken care of.
So would each project, as it comes up, get approval? Not necessarily from this committee, but as it goes?
Yeah, so each specific project that, the right way to say this, each specific project that would have some sort of an economic development agreement, and where that would be necessary is maybe there's some specific improvement that the city's going to agree to take on now in order for them to move forward with their development. So we'll do this, they promise to do that. That doesn't mean that any given or every single given business that decides to do something is going to have a development agreement or necessarily needs to. So for example, if in downtown there's sufficient funding, maybe, well, we'll talk about this concept. The universe of project costs would be eligible, what we would propose is that the universe of costs would be eligible to be paid from TIF revenues from either of the districts. So if there's significant development downtown that spins off enough revenue to be able to do the improvements in TIF 3 out towards the interstate, you could leverage those leverage those projects downtown to put in place the improvements on the other side, where now now the development can move forward out there and you don't have additional costs that you've got to incur at that point. So that would be the idea, but also hopefully, it gets going to the point where now you start having development and or redevelopment with businesses that are coming in, and maybe the infrastructure are already there and it's in place and serviceable. So now they're willing to just come in and make that investment. It's going to be part of the TIF district. The TIF district is going to help capture that revenue stream because it's resulting from those improvements that have been made, but there's no need for a specific development agreement. Now, are they going to be approved? Yes, because anybody that does anything like that, they're going to have to go through the normal city approval processes, planning commission, platting, whatever might be appropriate. So they'll still go through various processes, and the city will still be involved in decisions on that. But they might not have a specific development agreement or a need for a specific development agreement at that point.
Are those things that still have to be voted on by council as part of its normal process?
Yeah, to the extent that there's, required approvals, again, that has nothing to do with the TIF itself. Any development agreement would be voted on by the council and or maybe a public trust, depending on how it's structured.
So it doesn't matter if it's TIF 1 or TIF 2, you can leverage the increases from either one of those for the projects.
Yeah, if you get a major project in one, you could potentially leverage some of the revenue off of that to help do projects in the other increment district that would allow for the greater development.
And do I understand this correctly, that we do the TIF, are the property owners on board with talking to developers on sale of the property?
So they do not, I mean, you do not need their consent for them to be included in the TIF district. And again, that if they happen to be in the TIF boundary, it does not change their tax rate, it does not exempt them from paying taxes, it doesn't raise their taxes any, doesn't lower them. If they can reach an agreement with a developer to redevelop their property, or if they decide to do something themselves, whether it's sell it to somebody or build something new, then they would still pay whatever the taxes are due based on the levy rate, or based on the levy rate, and based on whatever the assessed value of the new improvement is. They would be responsible for paying those taxes, and then whatever portion of it is part of the increment would be captured by the TIF district, which would help pay the project costs. So the short answer, no. I mean, you don't need their consent, and if they decide to do nothing, it doesn't affect them, really. So that's kind of all of what we have to cover at this point. I promise there's more.
I was going to say, there's going to be a lot of questions and discussion as we move forward, because we're still gathering information and things
Sure.
being presented. So I know it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of discussion today, but we still don't have all the information we need to have those appropriate conversations.
Sure.
So anybody have any other questions before we move on to the next item? Yeah, it's all new to me too, so there's no dumb questions.
So I mean, again, it's a lot of information. You're seeing it for the first time, so don't feel like this is your only chance to ask questions. As you think of something, if you've got questions that come up, or comments, suggestion, whatever the case it is, just coordinate through the city. I guess, Susan, you want to be the contact? I mean, shoot an email to Susan, and we can. Some questions may be easy, and we'll answer them. We can get a response back pretty quick. Some of them we may aggregate and then come back, hopefully not aggregate and come back at future committee meetings and go through some of those questions. Some of them probably will result in more in-depth answers as well. So, and again, I mean, things that are coming are a set of assumptions as to what sort of revenues we reasonably think that could be generated on this. The additional project costs that might be appropriate to include. Again, if there's comments on the boundaries, things that are in or out, and kind of the why. Hopefully I've covered most of that, but the boundaries are not set at this point, but that's, again, just kind of represents our best judgment at this point, what we think is a good starting point to move forward, and what we'd at least recommend preliminarily be included.
Can I ask one more question? Because I'm still struggling a little bit with the projects, because it looks like they have to be done first before you'll ever see any improvements there or any build-up. So what are the different options that the city has for spending this money prior to getting any money out of the TIF?
So I'll say option A, which is the ideal situation, is a developer comes in and says, hey, I want to do this, but I've got to have this water line and this sewer line improved in order to be able to do it. And the city says, okay, well, if you'll pay for that up front, we'll reimburse you the cost of that improvement over time as part of a development agreement. So that's the ideal situation, because the individual or individuals that are best situated to cause there to be increment revenues to pay these costs are the people who are actually going out and doing development projects that are going to make investments, generate new ad valorem value, generate new sales and hotel tax dollars. So the risk lays with them. When they make those, they pay those costs up front. If they don't perform, then there won't be revenue to pay them back for those expenditures. And so that can all be built into a development agreement where they only get that to the extent that they're causing revenues to be generated. So option B then, either absent that or in supplement to that, is the city can look to various resources that it has at its disposal to go out. That may include, if they have cash available to make improvements, if they are able to obtain funding from other sources to pay all or portion of various costs, or they could go out and they could borrow funds. In a TIF district, you can borrow against the TIF revenue stream. It's really challenging to do that on the front end, unless you have a developer or developers that are willing to be the ones to buy the debt, which again, that's kind of the same situation of reimbursing them for the cost because they're still paying for it up front. But it's hard to go out and get a bond issue or third-party financing because they don't like the idea of being secured only by a revenue stream that doesn't exist yet and will only exist if the developers follow through and do what they propose. So in those instances, it's very likely that maybe as part of that development agreement, there's an agreement with the developer that to the extent that the revenue stream doesn't generate enough to pay the debt service, the developer may supplement. They may guarantee the payment of that debt service. The city, through one of its public trusts, might also go out and issue some sort of debt obligation that's secured by its sales tax for capital projects or secured by its utility systems, and utilize those to make, especially when you're talking about the capital improvements of water, sewer, traffic, and structure. They could potentially do that. Now, that's a real revenue stream that exists already, so if they have the appropriate credit to be able to go out and borrow those funds, they can demonstrate that they can pay it back from utility revenues or sales tax, whatever it is. They could then supplement that payment or reimburse themselves in the future for those debt service payments out of future TIF revenues once that's done. That scenario places more risk on the city because if the development doesn't occur, they might not get reimbursed for those costs. But the other side of that equation is you do have that enhanced asset that's a public asset that's available, and there may very well be future development just because you've got those assets now in place. So
I don't think on my question that I asked it appropriately, but I've been here 45 years and nothing's happened on this land out there. And it's up to the landowners to get with the developer and make their contract, right? If this isn't a TIF district, it's up to the property owners to sell their property to the developers.
yes.
So what, do we know if these landowners are?
Ultimately, they would either go find a developer and agree to sell, and the presence of the infrastructure makes that sort of development possible. So our projections will likely include some amount of development on these different projects. I mean, there may be some property that we develop fully and others that we just leave blank because we want to be somewhat conservative. Maybe one will happen and two won't, or vice versa. But the city will probably, I say probably, they will. I mean, they will actively promote development in the area. Kind of, we're open for business. We're making these infrastructure improvements. This is a good place to locate because of the proximity to the highway. You've got people driving by. Again, just all the normal economic development activities. What the TIF does is it provides a mechanism with that development, if it moves forward, provides that mechanism to pay for these infrastructure costs that we know have to occur unless otherwise development won't occur.
I understand all that, but it still comes down to the owner of the property.
Ultimately, they would have to be willing, yes. If they want to just, if they want to sit on their property, ultimately there's nothing, the city can't legally force them to develop it. So that's kind of this was a bigger deal, maybe 10 years or so ago. There was a national Supreme Court case.
I guess I'm just wondering, have we done that research? Is this property out there, are these landowners ready to sell? Do we know?
I mean, I don't know that I mean, I'm not the best person to speak to past economic development activities of the city. I don't know, I mean, if there's been.
I think there's been lots of conversations. There's been potential developers that want to develop up there. And that kind of comes down to the fact that we have a 6-inch water line that stops right there in front of Teague.
Right.
For us on septic, and so when they came to the city, we didn't have a funding mechanism to be able to encourage that kind of development. We don't have that kind of money in our budget to provide that. Our ordinances, there's a 250-foot, I believe, distance requirement. That's been a reasonable amount, so it's way farther than reasonable for us to ask them what to do. And so I definitely think that there's interest in that sense, but I don't think any of us could say that absolutely for certain we're going to adopt this and someone's going to move in there.
I can see developers wanting to be there. I just wonder if the landowners are interested in that.
Yeah, I know that there's people that have bought land and they kind of know that this has been going on. It's not been a specific conversation, but again, I think that that's something that kind of happens organically also when there is valuation in that property all of a sudden and interest. Because I think it has been empty for forever, obviously.
And that, I mean, that kind of goes to, I mean, what's the real purpose of the TIF district? But for the TIF district, being able to provide that mechanism to fund the infrastructure out there. I mean, there's not been infrastructure in the past, and consequently, there's also not been any significant development out there either. So again, that's the purpose of the TIF district, is to provide that mechanism so that development can move forward. Ultimately, you're right, I mean, any particular property owner, you know, they may or may not do something, and a lot of that will be the organic function of if somebody else comes along and makes it worth their while,
Right.
then they might be willing to do that.
This would be their opportunity.
Right.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. I think we're ready to move on to item 4, which is a selection of the next meeting time. Do you guys have a proposed date?
I would be inclined to say, probably give us at least 4 weeks to continue to fund. And we don't want to do this in more meetings than we have to, but I also don't want to assemble you every week, and, well, we don't really have anything new to add. So I would suggest maybe 4 or 5 weeks if we want to look towards the end of February. If this Wednesday afternoon time works, it's
So like the 21st, maybe?
21st or
Did
28th,
today's date
I'm
and time
thinking.
work for most everybody?
The 21st works for me.
I'll give everybody a second to look at their calendars.
Works for me.
Works for me.
Okay, well then I would entertain do I need a motion for this? Do we need to vote on this?
I don't
Okay.
think you have to vote it. Yeah, if 1 o'clock on Wednesday, February 21st works for the next meeting, then we'll go ahead and do that. It'll be a special call meeting. If something comes up, it's not going to work. If you find out you're going to be gone and we've got a significant number of people that doesn't work for all of a sudden, then we can try and find a different date.
So we're good with that? You good?
Yeah, I mean, I can move some things around.
What's happening at this next meeting?
So our hope would be at the next meeting, we've got hopefully the rest of the universe of our project costs, or most of it. And hopefully we've also got a reasonable set of development assumptions so that we can look at what would be the potential revenue streams that we're looking at. And then kind of in that context, whatever that revenue stream is, how does that compare to the universe of costs? and what sort of time frame and allocation might be appropriate.
And I may have missed it, but are we going to have some TIF projects identified by then too? Not necessarily in the TIF, but in the TIF project zone, or?
You mean as far as specific development projects?
Yeah.
So the projections will be based on a combination of potential projects to the extent that we can pin them down to give enough specificity as far as what they propose to do, and conservative development potential of the other properties within that. So as I say, we wouldn't project 100% build out of everything. You know, we'd probably kind of pick and choose and you know, maybe do some percentage of build out to, again, we want to identify a reasonable revenue stream. We don't want to grossly overestimate it. We also don't want to grossly underestimate it. We hope we underestimate it, but we want to have, you know, again, a reasonable set of assumptions, and we'll be able to lay all of that out of, all right, here's, you know, this many square feet of retail that, you know, is 60% occupied and has an average sales per square foot of $250 per year, and would have, you know, however many dollars of assessed value. And so that's going to generate this much ad valorem tax base on an annual basis. It's going to generate this much sales tax on an annual basis. And so kind of a collection of a whole bunch of lines of that, of the different assumptions across the two different districts to project how much revenue potentially might be forecast.
Okay. Okay, with that, I will, before I move on to item 5, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day, and this is a very important topic. You know, whether we choose to do a TIF or not, either decision is going to affect Chickasha for decades to come, so this is a very important time for Chickasha's future right now. So I just want to thank everybody in the audience for coming, and with that, I will entertain a motion for adjournment.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Motion, do I have a second?
Second?
And I don't need a vote on that, do I? We're good?
Good.